So what are the objectives of this training? All right. The first one is really to create an awareness of human rights and advocacy and care of the earth. Okay. And then the second one would be to bring about a change of mindset from a charity or service model of operating to a rights-based model. Okay, so these are some of the things that we will be addressing during during the training. Also, we would like to provide an opportunity to create an advocacy networking platform where participants can learn from one another, share their experiences, collaborate with, and even support one another. So these would be some of the objectives. And of course, there are so many other objectives that will come up for you, okay, and invite you to embrace them all. So today's training, the theme of today's training is the foundations of human rights and advocacy. And our presenter for today is the Executive Director of Edmund Rice International, Brother Brian Bond. Okay, he's from Australia and has spent many years both in education as a Christian brother, as well as administration, and has been then in Geneva and part of the Edmund Rice International team from its founding in 2008. And so Brian will be our presenter for today. And with that, I'm going to invite Brian, okay, to welcome everyone. All right, so Brian, here you go.
Okay, thank you, Tino. So yes, a very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the members of the ERI team. As Tino mentioned, my name is Brian Bond, an Australian Christian brother and Executive Director of ERI, which is based in Geneva. Although actually I'm speaking to you from our community house in Gaillard in France, which is a few hundred meters from the border with Switzerland, and about a 35-minute cycle ride from our office in the centre of Geneva. So our team consists of 4 brothers here in Geneva, Brother Tino Dubrow from India, whom you have already met and who will handle the technical side of these webinars, Brother Terry Dowling from South Africa, who will speak to you in a moment, and Brother Kevin Mullen from Ireland, and we also have Brother Kevin Corley in New York, who is part of our team. So before beginning the presentation, I'll just say a brief word about ERI. Edmund Rice International, or ERI, is a non-government organisation that was established in Geneva in 2007 to engage with the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. And ERI is supported by 2 Catholic religious congregations, both founded by Blessed Edmund Rice, the Christian Brothers and the Presentation Brothers. And we work with networks and partners in about 30 countries where the 2 congregations are present. And ERI has a special interest in the rights of children, in the right to education, and in the care of the earth, our common home. So we're very pleased to have this opportunity to engage with you all. We're also concerned with issues such as the rights of Indigenous peoples, the rights of asylum seekers and refugees, the rights of people with disabilities, just to mention a few issues. But we take up any issue that members of our network are concerned about within their particular country. And over the years, we've conducted training for members of our network in various countries and here in Geneva. And then we rely on our former trainees to provide us with the information we need to engage with the various human rights mechanisms. So how we do that will be explained in more detail in this series of webinars. And I'll just hand over now to Brother Terry Dowling, who will give an overview of the proposed training. Over to you, Terry.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Tino. Can you hear me?
Yes, Terry.
At the outset, welcome to everybody from so many different countries around the world. Just to say we are grateful for the support of Mission Cara for supporting these training sessions with so many different congregations joining in. And we hope, as Tino mentioned, that with so many different congregations and NGOs and people signing up, there will be chances for networking in the areas of advocacy that might be of interest to you personally and in your group. Just to state that these training sessions, the next 4 sessions, this one today and the next 3, are basic training sessions. They form the basis for further study and for further involvement. It's not going to be in depth. It will just give you the basis of where you can do further study in this area of advocacy, in the areas that Brian mentioned, and therefore for further involvement if you wish to take it on. So the first training session today is an understanding of the foundation of human rights and advocacy, and that's what Brian will be speaking to you about. The next training session is on the 12th of April. It's Edmund Rice International's engagement with the UN human rights system. I will be doing the presentation on that, and it involves basically 3 mechanisms: the Universal Periodic Review, the treaty bodies, and the special procedures. But there'll be more about that next week. The third one, on the 19th of April, which Tino will present, will be the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and advocacy. All the Sustainable Development Goals are underpinned by human rights law. So Tina will be explaining that and linking those together. And then the final one on the 26th of April will be by Brother Kevin Corley from New York, and it's Care of the Earth in the light of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si, and the link to the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's a brief overview of the 4 training sessions. So thank you. So back to you, Tina. Thank you.
Thanks, Terry. Thanks, Brian, for that. Okay, so I've already gone through the guidelines, so that's wonderful. And so with this, I just want to check. All right, Marcel, I don't know why your hand is up. Can you just give me a thumbs up if you can hear us clearly before we start? Okay. You could use even the reactions over there button at the bottom to just give me a thumbs up. Okay. Right, because just want to check that up. Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you. So with that, Brian, I hand over to you now, okay, to start your presentation. Over to you, Brian.
Okay, thanks, Tino. So I'll begin by sharing my screen. Okay. Okay, so in this presentation, I want to briefly address 3 things. Firstly, what we mean by advocacy. Secondly, I'll say something about human rights. And thirdly, I'll give a brief overview of the UN system and comment on some of those mechanisms that Terry mentioned. So I want to begin by clarifying what we mean by an advocacy or a justice response as opposed to a charity or a service response. And I'll do that by recounting my experience of working with students from our schools in Melbourne some years ago before coming to Geneva, and what were called street retreats. And I would take a group of students to a local parish where we would link up with volunteers from the St. Vincent de Paul Society who conducted a soup van, where they distributed unsold food that they'd collected from local shops at the end of the day, and they prepared some soup, and then they drove a van to a pre-arranged location where food was distributed to homeless people, people living on the streets or in cheap boarding houses. And at the end of that experience, we would debrief where the students shared and reflected on their experience. And the students always felt positive about that, as we all do when we do something good for others. But I would then point out to them, whilst what they had done was good and important, that food and conversation had been provided to those who needed it, nothing had changed for them. After the students returned home to their warm bed and their mother's cooking, these people would still be there tomorrow, the next week, the next month, probably the next year. And that leads to the why question. Why, in an affluent society like Australia, are people living on the streets? What does it say about the way our society cared for those suffering from mental illness? Because conversation soon revealed that a number of the people we met were suffering from some form of a mental illness. So asking why is the first step in advocacy, which aims to address the underlying causes of injustice. And how do we address those causes? By speaking to those who have the power to make the change, or better still, by empowering those affected to speak up for themselves. Usually, advocacy is directed at governments, perhaps multinational businesses or banks. For example, I recently joined a campaign and emailed directors of a Korean bank urging them to reject the financing of a proposed new coal mining project in Australia. But advocacy can take the form of letter writing, signing petitions, in-person lobbying, marches and demonstrations. Think of the climate action movement initiated by the young Swedish girl, Greta Thunberg. And advocacy can take place at the local level, at the national level, or at the international level, which is what we're primarily addressing in this webinar. So, to sum up, charity provides direct services like food, clothing, and shelter. Justice or advocacy promotes social change in institutions or political structures. Charity is directed at the effects of injustice, its symptoms. It addresses problems that already exist. Justice and advocacy is directed at the root causes of social problems and addresses the underlying structures or causes of these problems. Charity responds to immediate needs and looks for immediate solutions. Advocacy and justice responds to long-term needs and looks for long-term solutions. And that requires patience and perseverance. And it's very different from my experience of working in schools where you could teach some mathematics and give a test and find that at least most of the students had understood what was presented. You don't get that same sense of achievement in working in this area because often you can lobby without any apparent effect. Charity is often about private individual acts. Justice or advocacy is more effective with public collective action. Charity calms things down. Justice and advocacy stirs things up. We know from current and recent examples in places like Myanmar, Iran, Belarus, when demands for human rights challenge those in power, those who have an interest in preserving their privileged position can respond with repression and violence. Sadly, there are many current examples of threats and violence perpetrated on those who speak up for human rights or condemn injustice in many parts of the world. Jesus himself challenged the system in Israel of his time. He overturned the tables of the money changers in the temple that he saw as exploiting people. He condemned the Pharisees and religious leaders, calling them hypocrites, false guides, whitened sepulchres, and the rest. And that was a stand that was to ultimately cost him his life. And I think this quote from Helder Camara, a former bishop in Brazil, I think sums it up very well. When I feed the poor, they call me a saint. But when I ask why the poor are hungry, they call me a communist. So justice stirs things up. So I hope that makes it clear what we mean by advocacy, a justice and an advocacy approach rather than a charity approach. So the particular form of advocacy that we want to speak about is the advocacy work we engage with through the Human Rights Council of the United Nations here in Geneva. and that involves framing issues in terms of human rights. We call this a rights-based approach or rights-based advocacy, as opposed to what we could term a needs-based approach. When people are hungry, for example, we can argue that they need food to survive. But when advocating at the UN, it's necessary to argue in terms of people's right to food. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, includes the words, "Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and necessary social services." It was written in 1948, hence perhaps the sexist language, but it is understood to apply to women as well. So a needs-based approach to advocacy asks, what are the presenting issues and needs in a particular community? While a rights-based approach asks, what rights are being neglected or violated in this situation? Traditionally, a response has been to identify the need and to seek ways in collaboration with the community to address the situation, providing service, support, and assistance where necessary. In a rights-based approach, the question that arises is, why is it that these people can't enjoy their rights? A feature of a rights-based approach is that rights holders whose rights are denied can first come to a realisation that they have rights to which they're entitled, and then be empowered to find their voice and challenge the duty bearers, those who hold power, to change the unjust structures that hold them in bondage and deny them their capacity to live fully human lives. It might not always be possible that people can speak up for themselves through a lack of education or through imprisonment or through being at risk if they speak up. And so it might need others to speak on their behalf. For example, ERI was asked to speak at the current Human Rights Council session by a group of NGOs in Myanmar. They were afraid to speak or be identified because of fear of reprisal, so we spoke on their behalf. However, where possible, it is better for people to be able to speak for themselves, because this can enhance their dignity and self-worth. A needs-based approach, on the other hand, risks that people can become passive recipients of charity. So ERI's UN submissions are prepared by the people themselves as far as possible, facilitated by members of our network in regard to the wording and in negotiating the UN procedures. So we've made a number of references to human rights. So we'll now have a closer look at what is meant by human rights. And we will commence by viewing a video on the history of human rights. So if you give me a moment, I will share my screen once again.
Human rights is, geez, that's a good question.
Human rights. Oh, that's a tough one.
Wow.
I don't even know how to give that a definition.
I would probably have to do a little bit of homework or something.
Yeah, any right that I think just as a normal, human,
The rights that humans have.
Oh, that's a very large debate.
Zu mange ting.
Tú le puedes preguntar a 20 personas y te van a dar 20 diferentes opiniones.
Non saprei, una domanda complicatissima.
Yes, we just take them for granted that they're there, but we don't even consider what they are.
Human rights are the rights you have simply because you're human. It's how you instinctively expect and deserve to be treated as a person, like the right to live freely, to speak your mind, and to be treated as an equal. There are many kinds of rights. Most apply to a certain group. But human rights are the only ones that apply to absolutely everyone, everywhere. That means kids, old people, poor people, basketball players, garbage men, rappers, teachers, Africans, Indians, Albanians, Christians, Muslims, Kabbalists, atheists, your mom, your dad, your next door neighbor, and you all have the exact same human rights. In other words, they're universal. But the question remains, what are they?
Name the human rights?
What the human rights are?
The right to live.
Equality between all peoples.
Right to religion, the right to...
Is there supposed to be a list somewhere I should be aware of?
According to the United Nations, there are a total of 30 human rights. which are usually lumped together and called simply human rights. They're all listed out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the world's most widely accepted document on the subject. But it was a long time in coming. At first, there were no human rights. If you were in with the right crowd, you were safe. If you weren't, well, you weren't. But then a guy named Cyrus the Great decided to change all that. After conquering Babylon, he did something completely revolutionary. He announced that all slaves were free to go. He also said people had the freedom to choose their religion, no matter what crowd they were a part of. They documented his words on a clay tablet known as the Cyrus Cylinder. And just like that, human rights were born. The idea spread quickly to Greece, to India, and eventually to Rome. They noticed that people naturally followed certain laws, even if they weren't told to. They called this natural law, but it kept getting trampled on by those in power. Not until 1,000 years later in England did they finally get a king to agree that no one can overrule the rights of the people, not even a king. People's rights were finally recognized, and they were now safe from those in power. Kind of. It still took a bunch of British rebels declaring their independence before the king got the point that all men are created equal. Which isn't to say he liked the idea, but he couldn't stop them, and America was born. The French immediately followed with their own revolution for their own rights. Their list was even longer, and they insisted that these rights weren't just made up. They were natural. The Roman concept of natural law had become natural rights. Unfortunately, not everyone was so thrilled. In France, a general named Napoleon decided to overthrow the new French democracy and crown himself emperor of the world. He almost succeeded, but the countries of Europe joined forces and defeated him. Human rights was again a hot topic. They drew up international agreements, broadly granting many rights across Europe. But only across Europe. The rest of the world somehow still didn't qualify. Instead, they got invaded, conquered, and consumed by Europe's massive empires. But then a young lawyer from India decided enough was enough. His name was Mahatma Gandhi, and in the face of violence, he insisted that all people of Earth had rights, not just in Europe. Eventually, even Europeans started to agree. But it wasn't going to be that easy. 2 world wars erupted. Hitler exterminated half the Jewish population of Earth in horrifying Nazi death camps. And all told, 90 million people died. Never had human rights been so terrifyingly close to extinction. And never had the world been more desperate for change. So the countries of Earth banded together and formed the United Nations. Their basic purpose was to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. But what were human rights? Were they the proclamations of Cyrus, the natural laws of Rome, the declarations of France? Everyone seemed to have a slightly different idea of what human rights should be. But under the supervision of Eleanor Roosevelt, they finally agreed on a set of rights that applied to absolutely everyone. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The French concept of natural rights had finally become human rights. So, in summary, at first, only a few lucky people had any rights, until one of those guys decided, hey, other people should have some rights too, which was great, except not everyone agreed. And it only took a few thousand years of fighting and declarations and more fighting until everyone finally agreed that human rights should apply to everyone. And they all lived happily ever after. Except for one little problem. If people have the right to food and shelter, why are 16,000 children dying of starvation every day? 1 every 5 seconds. If people have freedom of speech, why are thousands in prison for speaking their minds? If people have the right to education, why are over 1 billion adults unable to read? If slavery has truly been abolished, why are 27 million people still enslaved today? More than twice as many as in 1800. The fact is, when it was signed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights did not have the force of law. It was optional. And despite many more documents, conventions, treaties, and laws, it's still little more than words on a page. So the question is, who will make those words a reality?
I have a dream today.
When Dr. King marched for racial equality, he was marching for rights that had been guaranteed by the United Nations for almost 2 decades. But still, he marched. When Nelson Mandela stood up for social justice in the 1990s, his country had already agreed to abolish such discrimination for almost 40 years. But still, he fought. Those who fight today against torture, poverty, and discrimination are not giants or superheroes. They're people. Kids, mothers, fathers, teachers. Free-thinking individuals who refuse to be silent. Who realize that human rights are not a history lesson. They're not words on a page. They're not speeches or commercials or PR campaigns. They are the choices we make every day as human beings. They are the responsibility we all share to respect each other, to help each other, and to protect those in need. As Eleanor Roosevelt said, where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere.
Okay, so apologies for that delay, but that, as that video demonstrated, the Universal Declaration was the culmination of centuries of struggle, and it was the horrors experienced in the wars of the 20th century that led to the establishment of the UN and agreement about human rights. Regrettably, at present, we're seeing a retreat from human rights and the ideals of the United Nations at the very time when we most need solidarity in the face of the current and recent pandemic and the climate emergency. And instead, we're seeing a reassertion of nationalism in places such as China, Russia, the United Kingdom with its withdrawal from Europe, India, Turkey. The list goes on. But that's a story we don't really have time to go into. So I'm going to go back now. Hopefully I can figure out how to share the screen again to show the PowerPoint. Can you see that?
Yes, yes, Brian, that's perfect.
Okay. So, talking about human rights are universal and inalienable. They apply to all people, everywhere, at all times. They can be denied or violated, but that doesn't mean they don't still exist. They're indivisible. They're all equally important and all must be respected. The criticism of the US, for example, is that political rights such as the right to free speech, peaceful assembly, etc., are stressed, whilst other rights such as the right to an adequate standard of living are not assigned the same priority, resulting in an unacceptable level of poverty. By comparison, China, for example, has made great strides in lifting people out of poverty, but there are serious concerns about its respect for civil and political rights, the right to free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, etc. The point is that All rights are important. And I'd also add that no country has a perfect record on human rights. The third thing to say about human rights is that they're interdependent and interrelated. The fulfillment of one right often depends wholly or in part on the fulfillment of others. For example, the fulfillment of the right to an adequate standard of living may depend on having access to education or to social security. Or the enjoyment of the right to education may depend upon having the right to food. A child that comes to school hungry, for example, may not be in a position to learn. I would also add that sometimes it can be difficult to balance different rights. For example, freedom of speech. Does that mean that hate speech is acceptable, or incitement to violence that might threaten the life and the right to life and well-being of others? What about the freedom of speech and the right to privacy? Are we free to speak about the private lives of celebrities, as happens in certain types of gossip magazines? Then there's a controversial issue like abortion. How do we balance a woman's right to health, for example, with the right to life of an unborn child? It would be true to say that in the UN, the perceived rights of the health to the woman takes precedence over the right to life of the unborn child, which is not the position of the Catholic Church, of course. Although there's no recognised right to abortion, the term reproductive rights is often used in a way that assumes a right to abortion. And that perhaps raises another more basic question: does an unborn child have any rights at all? So a related question might be about children's rights. Should children be free to exercise all their rights when perhaps they lack maturity and experience and could be at risk of making decisions that are harmful for themselves? Children's rights are spelled out in more detail in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I'll speak about later. And Article 5 of that convention does speak of a child's right to receive appropriate direction and guidance from their parents and guardians. Who is responsible for ensuring human rights, we might ask? The answer is we all are. We have a duty to respect the rights of others. In making presentations like this, particularly to teachers, I often hear comments like, it's all very well to speak to students about their rights, but what about their responsibilities? And the answer to that, I think, is to remind students that everyone has the same rights, and those must be respected. It's not just about my rights. And of course, governments bear a particular responsibility. They are the major duty bearers. So I'll now move on to the third part of the presentation, which is to give a brief overview of the UN. And the UN was established after World War II to maintain international peace and security, to develop and foster friendly relations between nations, and to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems. And the UN today is a vast, complex organisation. So don't try and remember the detail of what follows, but just try and get an overall sense of what I'm saying. So there are 6 major organs of the UN. The General Assembly, which meets in New York and which all 193 states of the world participate. There's a Security Council, which is a limited number of states are part of that. States are elected to it, but there are 5 permanent members, and they each have the right to veto any decision. The 5 permanent members, the USA, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, all were on the winning side in World War II. Then there's the Economic and Social Council, or ECOSOC, which also meets in New York, and it has a responsibility for advancing sustainable development in the economic, social, and environmental spheres. There's the International Court of Justice, which is based in The Hague in the Netherlands, which is there to settle legal disputes settled to it by states and to give advisory opinions on legal questions referred to it by the various UN organs and specialised agencies. The International Court of Justice is not to be confused with the International Criminal Court, which is there to prosecute war crimes. but it is not, it's a separate body and it's not recognised by all countries. I mentioned the Secretariat, which is a vast bureaucracy to support the work of the UN, to do translations and prepare minutes and various other tasks. And then there's the Trusteeship Council, which was set up to oversee the transition of former colonies and territories to self-governance. And it's in brackets because it's currently on hold. In addition to those principal organs, there are a range of subsidiary bodies or committees or boards or councils, working parties. One of the most important of these subsidiary bodies is the Human Rights Council, which meets in Geneva and which has particular responsibility for the strengthening, promotion and protection of human rights. And as we've indicated, it's the Human Rights Council that we primarily engage with. The NGOs can apply to make statements during discussions and debates at sessions of the Human Rights Council, and those statements can be useful in raising awareness about particular issues of concern. And ERI has made about 15 statements, more than that actually, some with our partners during the recent Human Rights Council session. And links to the webcast recordings of those statements are included in our monthly newsletter, so you'll be able to read them there. Some were included in the March newsletter, some will be included in the April newsletter, which comes out in a couple of weeks' time. Other examples of UN organisations and agencies, which you may have heard of: UNESCO is based in Paris, the World Health Organization is based in Geneva. The International Labour Organization is also based in Geneva. The United Nations Environmental Programme is based in Nairobi, and there are many others. The list goes on. The UN has also adopted various treaties, conventions, protocols, and declarations. You can see this list of the 9 core human rights treaties and the date that they came into force. They have a legal status, but they can't be enforced because the UN has no international enforcement mechanism. In addition to the treaties, there are optional protocols, which are often legal provisions complementing an existing treaty, which has to be ratified separately by countries. To give an example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child came into force in 1989, and that was before the internet was widely used. And since the introduction of the internet, unfortunately, a whole range of issues related to child pornography have arisen. So rather than attempting to rewrite the convention, an initial treaty was drafted, which can be ratified separately by member states. So that's an example of an optional protocol. Declarations are not intended to be legally binding, but are intended to give voice to particular aspirations. And then, of course, the most fundamental human rights document is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which all countries have accepted. And it was described by Pope John Paul II as one of the highest expressions of the human conscience of our time. So the 9 core human rights treaties are listed there. Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatments or Punishments, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was the most widely ratified treaty of all, ratified by all countries in the world except one, the United States. The International Convention of the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. It's up to each UN member state to agree to be bound by and to ratify a treaty. And as I said, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is the most widely ratified treaty. So the UN has then set up a series of committees of independent experts whose job is to monitor states' compliance with the treaties that they've committed to. And these are called treaty bodies. The treaty bodies meet regularly. They consider the states parties' reports, and they can also have a mechanism to consider individual complaints or communications about violations of the treaty in a particular country. They also publish general comments on the content of the treaties, and they organise discussions on related themes. And the treaty bodies meet in Geneva. When a country ratifies one of these treaties, it assumes a legal obligation to implement the rights recognised in the treaty, but it also has an obligation to submit regular reports to the treaty body on how those rights are being implemented. So in addition to the government report, the treaty body can accept information on a country's human rights situation from other sources, including non-government organisations. So in the light of the information that comes from the country, the UN, and from non-government organisations, the committee examines those reports while meeting with the government representatives, questions the government representatives, and based on the dialogue, the committee publishes its concerns and recommendations, referred to as concluding observations, which are suggestions about how the country can better comply with its observations, with its obligations. So another option for advocacy groups is to submit an alternative report with questions and recommendations to the treaty body committee undertaking a review of a particular country, which hopefully will then be addressed during the course of the review. And that's a mechanism that the ERI has engaged with. Of course, submitting reports is just one task. There's also a very important role for advocates in following up recommendations and commitments made by governments, which are all publicly available. So, and that can be done even if you haven't submitted a report. And raising awareness about these mechanisms and the reports is in itself a very important step in advocacy. The Human Rights Council also oversees two important mechanisms for monitoring human rights. The Universal Periodic Review, which is the most important mechanism that we make use of, and special procedures. So I'll now say something briefly about each. Universal Periodic Review. Each country has its human rights record reviewed by the other UN member states every 4 to 5 years in Geneva. Again, NGOs can submit reports and make recommendations and then lobby states to put forward their issues of concern. Sometimes we do that here in Geneva, but it can also be done by local people lobbying the foreign embassies in their own country. Earlier this year, ERI submitted statements for the reviews of Argentina, Ghana, Peru, and Zambia, which took place in January. And just this week, we made a joint submission with one of our partners for the review of Canada, which is due to take place in November. And Tino or Terry will say more about the UPR in his presentation later in this course. And finally, just to say something about special procedures briefly, the Human Rights Council can appoint an independent expert or rapporteur or working group to examine and report on the situation in a particular country or in regard to a particular theme. Currently, there are 44 thematic and 14 country mandates. Some examples of thematic mandates are the Special Rapporteur on the right to food, the Special Rapporteur on the right to safe drinking water and sanitation, Special Rapporteur on trafficking in persons, especially in women and children, and the list goes on. 44, as I said, in total. And then the countries where human rights concerns have resulted in the appointment of the Special Rapporteur are listed there. Afghanistan, Belarus, Burundi, Cambodia, Central African Republic, North Korea, Eritrea, Iran, Mali, Myanmar, occupied Palestinian territories, Russia, Somalia, and Syria. Russia and Afghanistan just had their special rapporteurs appointed very recently. And just to repeat that in all of this, the NGOs, just to add, NGOs can make direct contact with special rapporteurs and raise issues of concern, or they can request the rapporteur to make a visit to their country. They can also raise awareness about the recommendations that are made in the reports of the Special Rapporteur. The Special Rapporteur reports to the Human Rights Council regularly, and then engage in advocacy with their government about implementing the recommendations of the rapporteurs. But just to repeat that in all of these procedures, it's important to remember that the UN doesn't have the power to compel states to do anything. And many states ignore or defy the international community. But states are sensitive to international opinion, and they can be open to respectful, well thought out suggestions and recommendations. And positive change is possible. And we've seen that with our advocacy efforts with the UPR and special procedures mechanisms. So I will stop there.
We've all seen this poster. Today's session by Brian was Understanding the Foundation of Human Rights and Advocacy. Terry, on the 12th of April, at the same time as today, okay, we'll be sharing with you, okay, the UN human rights system, all the mechanisms, okay, that ERI engages with and how ERI engages with them. So please join in on the 12th of April, same time as today, for Terry's session over there. Okay, at this stage, what I'm going to do is I'm going to once again give the spotlight to you, Brian, and maybe you'd like to comment on some of the questions that came up.
Okay, thanks, Tino. Yes, I mean, there's so many comments and questions, it's impossible to deal with them all, but it was pleasing to see the positive feedback. But just to comment on a couple of things, or several things. First of all, I want to perhaps clarify that whilst I was talking about the importance of advocacy, I wouldn't want to say that we don't continue to do charity. I think charity is important as well. So both of those responses are important. A number of people commented about the UN and its ineffectiveness or whatever. And yes, it is politicized and it's flawed. And a concern within the UN is the safety of human rights defenders. But still, in spite of those things, I think it is still our world's best hope. I mean, imagine if it didn't exist. I think things would be even worse. And perhaps to give a positive example, this was quoted to me when I first came to Geneva. You know, back in the 1950s, I won't have the numbers correct, but it would have been a handful of countries had abolished the death penalty. As we enter the 2020s, you know, well over 100 countries have abolished the death penalty. So that was sort of imperceptible progress. And I think that happens. And another analogy I like to use is of snowflakes falling on the branch of a tree. An individual snowflake falling doesn't make any difference, but with persistence and a constant effort and a build-up of such flakes, eventually the branch might break, and so change or a breakthrough can occur. Someone asked for an example of a success. So just very briefly, if I go to the UPR of Papua New Guinea, which was reviewed, and the example is from several years ago. Our brothers in Papua New Guinea are the major organisation working with people with disability. And they informed us that the Papua New Guinea government didn't have any policy directed towards people with disability. But they said before they can even formulate a policy, they need to establish a database. How many people are there with disability? What's the nature of their disability? Where are they located? And we put that forward into submission. We lobbied for the submission. We visited permanent missions here in Geneva. And I think it was the permanent mission of Slovenia that put forward our recommendation to Papua New Guinea. And Papua New Guinea accepted that recommendation. So we could then go back to our people on the ground and say, Papua New Guinea has accepted the recommendation that they establish a database. It's your job to make contact with the relevant people in government and say, we'd like to work with you in establishing this database. A very small step, but a positive one. Someone asked about why the US hasn't ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I think it's mainly due to the political system in the US, where all states have to agree, and also there is a strong lobby group among parents who resist giving the idea of giving rights to children because they think it undermines parental rights. A number of people sort of raise particular issues. For example, legislation regarding conversions in India, and ask sort of what could be done about it. Well, I just mentioned that, you know, there is a special rapporteur on the freedom of religion, so it could be an issue that's raised with that person. It could be a subject of recommendations that are made in a UPR submission for the next review of India. And of course, India would say that, you know, it has got freedom of religion in its constitution, etc. And, you know, countries will often quote their constitution or official policy, but there can be a gap between what is said in documents like that and what happens in practice. And that also can be an issue that is raised. So it is possible. We have a coordinator in each country who coordinates the putting together of a submission. And then one of the other points that came through a number of times was the lack of awareness about human rights among so many people. And I think that's very true. And it's been my experience too in visiting countries and making these presentations. So I think that's at least something that you can do within your ministry to raise awareness about human rights, whether it's among the students that you work with or the other group. And that is another group, and that is an important first step. So I certainly invite you to consider how you can incorporate what you've heard into your current ministry. And you might also like to visit our website where you can learn more about our work. You can access the statements and submissions that we've made at the UN. You can see recent newsletters. You can sign up for our monthly newsletter. And you can also obtain a lot of information from UN websites. And I think Tino intends to follow up with an email with some links and suggested resources following this. So I think I'll leave it at that and hand you back to Tino or Terry, who might want to respond to some other comments or questions.
Okay, so Terry, if you'd like to make any comments, you're welcome.
Yeah, some person asked, can they de-ratify a convention? I think they can, Brian. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. I don't think it's ever happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I think what came through to me is what can people do on the ground? And I think the most important thing is to raise awareness and empower people to take stand, etc. I just, for example, what in my limited whatever, I could see what the farmers did in India to object to what was happening. Here in France, people are objecting to the idea of raising the pension age from 62 to 64 or something like that, but they are objecting to it. So when people know their rights and they are empowered, they can take stands on the ground. Somebody asked what they can do in the school situation. I'm sure as part of the education scheme in the school is to show to the students what their rights are and empower them, that when they leave school, they've got a path to follow in terms of human rights. But even at the global, there's human rights law, there's humanitarian law, there's the Geneva Convention, even though sometimes these things are broken, but they do exist. So I just wanted to emphasize that. Thanks, Tina.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.